welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is a researcher in what has often been described as the final frontier in biology, and looks at what has also been described as amongst the most complex mechanisms known. She's the director of the National Brain Research Center. Her work has won more than 1,000 citations. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Vijayalakshmi Ravindranath.
Good afternoon.
The brain. You know, when we talk about the brain, we sort of think of the intellectual and the rational, and when we talk about, you know, the heart, we think about the emotions. What is the brain?
To me, as a neuroscientist, the brain encompasses everything that we are today. Our civilization, our culture, what makes us the human beings. As you know, the Human Genome Project did one very good thing. It told us the importance of brain. Between the mouse and the humans, there's a difference of not more than 5 to 10,000 genes. But you know what makes us the humans we are as compared to the mouse. So, and that difference, I think, it's the brain that actually encompasses and makes us what we are.
So the brain is sort of geographically located, and I don't know how much of it I have, it's sort of geographically located at the top of one's head. How would you describe the brain? What is it made of? We sort of have a sense of its functions, but...
The brain is about, you know, 1.5 kilograms in weight. It represents about 1.5 to 2%. It consumes about 20% of the oxygen that we use up, the cardiac output of blood, and uses tons of energy. But it's a, you could say it's a mass made up of cells and wiring, and actually when you open the brain up, it's like a jigsaw puzzle put together, because it's made up of discrete nuclei, as we like to call them, each of which having very specialized functions and how they relate to each other. For example, when we look at vision, it starts from the eye and it goes right up to the back of the brain, which is the visual cortex, where we perceive, and then it's transmitted back. So we have these specialized systems for each of our senses, the sense of touch, the sense of hearing, the sense of the vision, and so on.
How does the brain function with most sort of parts of, you know, when we think of the heart, you know, we think of something moving, and then there are muscles. You know, the brain is complex and is dealing with great complexity. So what happens inside the brain when there are thoughts, emotions, impulses, dreams? Is there movement?
Well, in brain, communication occurs through electrochemical impulses, both electricity as well as chemical. And it's essentially, I would relate it like a telephone exchange, where the cells communicate with each other, and there's a good hierarchical arrangement, and essentially it's these electrical impulses that let's put, I think in simplistically I would say the cells communicate with each other and the information is processed. So neurons not only receive and you know, reciprocate the information, but they also process the information. I always like to say the brain doesn't replicate external reality. It restructures and recreates external reality. For example, if you and me see a same picture, what you would think about it and what I would think about it would be very different. And this is what makes the brain an information processor. I think the best way to describe it would be an information processor.
So when you say we think differently, so would there be different biochemical impulses in the brain, in your case and mine, if we were looking at the same painting?
Actually, in the last decade, brain research has made tremendous progress, and one of the reasons has been that we have imaging techniques that has allowed us to glimpse or have a window into a brain while it's actually functioning, called the functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. And fMRI studies have very clearly shown the way the young and the old people process the same information is different. Suppose a young man is shown a picture and asked to make a decision about it. He looks at it, he uses a lot more part of the brain, and then he will quickly try to memorize that picture and then make a decision. The older is smarter, he uses less of the brain, and when he thinks it's not necessary, he won't put it into his long-term memory, but give a quick judgment on that picture.
So implicit in this is the aspect of training. So is it possible, like in the case of cardiovascular disease, you know, you're told to exercise and to do certain things that will make the heart more efficient. Are there things that you can do to make the brain more efficient?
Yeah, see, that's another thing that we have learned in the last decade. Earlier we thought the brain was a static organ, and as you got older you lost the cells and the brain actually atrophied or shrunk. But today we believe that the brain is a dynamic plastic organ. The more you use it, the better it gets. And in fact, we have a maxim that I often use when I give my talks: use it or lose it. So what you don't use actually is lost. And there's a very interesting study that was done a couple of years ago on London taxi drivers. The London taxi drivers have excellent spatial memory because they have to memorize road maps. So this group in England, they did a study. They took a bunch of London taxi drivers and measured their brain volumes, certain regions of the brain involved in memory. And what they found was, in the London taxi drivers, a part of the hippocampus that's involved in memory was actually larger in size. And the interesting thing is, the size increase was proportional to the number of years they drove the taxi. So it was not as if people who had larger hippocampus became taxi drivers. But after becoming taxi drivers, the more and more they used their brain, that part of the brain got larger. There's another study that has come out where you give simple working memory tasks, we call them, where you see pattern recognition. The more you train the people, the better their brain becomes at it. And then you see the activation patterns are different. So I firmly believe that we haven't even realized a small potential of what our brain can do. And the more we challenge it, the more we use it, the more creative we are, the better and better we are going to become.
So just as there are sort of recommended good health practices and approaches for most physiological functions, what are some of the recommended practices to keep the brain ticking, to be happier, and other such sort of somewhat abstract?
Yeah, I would say learning newer skills, avoiding passive stimulants like sitting in front of the TV and just watching, but being more actively involved, what we also call mindfulness. That is, when we do something, there are two ways of doing it. One is to be aware of it and be conscious of the decisions you take and how you do it. The other is to be on an autopilot. So this mindfulness is a wonderful way of keeping the brain active. And being, you also see older people who are in their 70s and 80s who still take a very active interest in what's going on. They write, they read. Even they say playing Scrabble helps, delay Alzheimer's onset. So anything that challenges you and makes you work would be the best, especially for children. I would say that would be very, very important.
You're watching a conversation with Dr. Vijayalakshmi Ravindranath, founder director of the National Brain Research Center. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to my conversation with the founder director of the National Brain Research Institute, Dr. Ravindranath. You were talking about mindfulness as being sort of a desirable process in training the mind. Now that's a phrase that's very often used and associated with techniques of meditation and structured meditation. But before I come to that, implicit in techniques of meditation is a notion of mind. And where do you locate the mind in the brain?
It's a very hard question to answer, and I think that's the ultimate challenge, the challenge of understanding consciousness and mind. To us, the brain mediates the mind to a large extent. Without the brain, we wouldn't have a mind. And I think neuroscientists, while imaging techniques have given us some understanding, like we know that when somebody feels a thirst, a certain part of the brain is activated. So that's consciousness. But this is an area which is, I as a neuroscientist, an experimental neuroscientist, I really can't say much, except to say that there are evidence that before you do an act, there is a certain activation in the brain. The power of will, our wanting to do, which we still don't understand how the brain mediates that, goes a long way in mediating mind and consciousness. Enough to say that we are making the slow progress of trying to understand bit by bit how the brain puts together, and maybe in a few days, a few years, not far away from today, I would probably be sitting here and be able to give you a more correct answer on how this, what we call as neurobiological correlates of consciousness. That's where a lot of our research is focused upon. How?
What does current research point to? In what direction do you think it might be unfolding?
Well, the big difference that has been made is, as you know, scientists are great reductionists. We like to work at a very molecular level, and brain research typically has grown in two directions. One is, the behavior, the psychologists at one end of the spectrum, and the molecular biologists at the other end of the spectrum. The big difference that has happened today is we have realized the need to integrate the two and work in a manner where what we call the bottom up or the top down approach, to integrate the two and go all the way from molecules to the mind. Certain progress has been made. For example, we know when we try to, if I'm trying to remember this conversation with you today, I would actually store it in my long-term memory. There will be new proteins synthesized in my brain, and I would also know what those proteins are. For this London taxi driver story I told you, the more you use, the connections are strengthened. So there is a degree of will in the taxi driver's ability to understand the road maps too. So we understand up to that point. But to get it down into an overall conceptual level and say, hey, this is what mediates consciousness, we are far away from it now.
And yet, very often, sort of scientists, when they see the sort of the wonder of what we have described as, the last frontier of biology, the most difficult entity, complex entity known, there is a sense of surrender to an external principle. There is something ordering the universe. People like Einstein have sort of said that. When I look at the universe, I'm so awestruck by it that there must be what you would describe as divinity. Has that sort of kind of feelings come up for you? Something beyond the ability of science and the rational mind to figure out?
It's hard, because as scientist, my training is the search for truth. We ask a question, we plan an experiment, we observe, and out of those observations we try to unravel the mystery. So our lives are based on evidence, concrete evidence of what we see.
Don't you, implicit in that, are the limits of what you're able to see?
Definitely.
And then what happens beyond the limits of what you're able to see?
That's the question. I mean, the small thing that I would today, one of the things that we have done is to take people who do meditation and map their brains and look at what's happening. And we do know that their ability, their will, so-called, or their ability, for example, they can do with a lot less sleep than others. And even when they sleep, the certain types of the patterns that you see, electrical patterns, are very different from those of people who don't meditate. So those are small progress that we have made. But in terms of, I'm not good at mixing issues. For me, God is the goodness that we see among all of us, that we see within each of us. So I can't bring that into the purview of my neuroscience. I am very compartmentalized and focused in my, but definitely the whole mystery of consciousness, how are we able to do things? Those are issues that are very important. And actually, neuroscience has always benefited from trying to understand the diseased brain. Typically, that's how we have gone about. The diseased brain has often yielded more information than studying a normal brain. So, for example, looking at mentally ill patients, how they see the things they see or perceive, those have been experimental results that have yielded us at least glimpses into the way the mind functions. I think we are just there now, and I would pursue it in that respect. So looking at an obsessive compulsive disorder patient who always wants to wash hands, but how we can convert him by medication and behavioral therapy and tell him that what is telling him to wash his hand repeatedly is just a voice but not him. So those things I could work on, but I don't like mixing up issues.
You mentioned compartmentalization. Is there a you beyond the scientist that has a sense of God and the divine in everyday life?
I mean, there is the personal me who, but then science is horrible because you inevitably take it home. Everything you do, it becomes a part of your training. You're taught to be analytical, objective, logical, integrity, honesty. These are so enmeshed into your personality.
So will these describe you?
I try to be. I would only say I try, because I personally believe if a scientific temperament is taught to children, you would have a wonderful society of adults a few years from today. So it's hard to separate myself from that science.
You've mentioned this notion of truth, and yet to many people truth is relative. Not just philosophically, but even in terms of the processes of scientific research. Today's truth is tomorrow's inaccuracy. So how do you deal yourself with that uncertainty in some ways?
Well, for example, say I was doing an experiment and I got a result and I analyzed it and I got that conclusion. Yeah, tomorrow in the perspective of something more that would be known, it may not have been true, but the time that I concluded, it was based on that truth. And as I said, the brain is evolving, all of us are evolving. It is a dynamic situation, it's not static. So, but the ability to correct oneself would be very, very important, and to acknowledge that, hey, under those circumstances, it was not correct. I mean, to make mistakes is human. You wouldn't be human if you didn't make mistakes.
You're watching In Conversation with Dr. Vijayalakshmi Ravindranath. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away.
I'm not good at religion.
Welcome back to my conversation with Dr. Vijayalakshmi Ravindranath, who's the founder director of the National Center for Brain Research. Dr. Ravindranath, you were talking about the diseased brain. There is sort of considerable interest and concern at the new biochemical approaches to treating mental disorders, shall we say, and raises the whole morality question that that there have been a lot of research on the use of Prozac, for example, to transform personality, to overcome shyness. So we're not just looking at the extreme problems like schizophrenia or what have you, but you mentioned obsessive compulsive disorders. So there's a range of disorders, and not all of them disorders in the extreme classical sense that can be addressed by approaching the biochemistry of the brain. So it's not, we're in 2004, so this isn't sort of 1984, it's 20 years later. But do you think that there is the risk that we might be moving in that direction?
Actually, in a country like India, I would say we are on the other side, because brain disorders contribute up to 1/3 of disease burden. Mental illnesses affect, the prevalence rate is 25%. Schizophrenia has 1% incident rate. We are talking of huge populations who are affected. And today we clearly understand that brain disorders do have a biochemical basis. Yes, the danger of over-medication in terms of transforming personality is one end of the spectrum, but here you have this huge population of people who are affected, who are suffering, their families suffer even more, and who are a burden on the society in terms of the man-hours lost. And it's a huge population attached with so much of stigma, as well as underdiagnosed and undertreated. Actually, my concern has been more in that. I know in the Western countries, there has been the talk of over-medication in children, especially those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They say that 5 to 7% of their children have this ADHD, and they have been treating them with drugs like Prozac and Ritalin. But I think a wise judgment would be that a good clinician should be able to evaluate the necessity of medication and treat them with the medication to alleviate the suffering, because the suffering a mentally ill person undergoes, no other person can even fathom the extent of it. For example, in obsessive compulsive disorder, you would think he just wants to wash his hands, but you deprive him of that, and the agony he undergoes is just something that's much more than physical pain. And if left untreated, he's going to suffer and suffer. And not only he suffers, the family also suffers. I think we need to take that into cognizance, treat judiciously. But as of now, in this, especially in our country, we are far from over-medicating. We are actually underdiagnosing and undertreating, because the incident rates are same in India as in the Western world for most mental illnesses.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that this approach is up against in a country like India is notions of God, of karma, of a whole range of traditional belief systems that run counter to this approach, including what we spoke about, mindfulness and meditation, which suggests that the biochemistry of the brain can be reversed by consciously planting thoughts in the brain that will then generate a biochemical response, just as the biochemical impulse generates particular thoughts. What about the moral, ethical questions that come into intervening in this manner?
For me, personally, I think whether you treat, as much as you treat a diabetic or a rheumatoid arthritis, you should treat a mentally ill. There's no question there. Just like you have an imbalance of glucose metabolism, insulin, you treat them with anti-diabetic, here he has an imbalance of chemicals in the brain that he needs to be treated. But then we know very well that when you combine pharmacotherapy with behavioral therapy, you have better outcome. And that's the added component in the brain. But in my mind as a scientist, I see no moral dilemma there. But definitely our strength of our spiritual values, our religion will help us overcome this, but we have to aid it in terms of giving it the medication that's needed when needed.
But what is the prospect that with biochemical interventions in the brain, we might yet be able to create Superman?
That won't happen.
Why not?
Because the drugs go up to a point. Even if you take a population of, let's take a small group of 10 people, you give them Prozac, not all respond similarly.
In fact, that has been an area of your research.
Yes.
What are the conclusions that this has led to?
Well, I look at, my years at NIMHANS in Bangalore. I think that's what drives me in this job even today, because I've seen tremendous number of people suffering. And you have a sizable population of mentally ill who don't respond to medication. And they go through years and years, a lifetime, because they have normal lifespan. So one of my research areas has been why don't people respond to drugs? Is it because they metabolize it differently? Does the human brain have capabilities of handling drugs which are different from what we know? So that's been a small part of my research. The other part of my research deals with Parkinson's disease and gender differences, how estrogen is neuroprotective to the brain.
But let's look at this aspect of how different people react to drugs. What are some of the conclusions that you have arrived at here?
Essentially, this is an area called pharmacogenomics, which has been in the news a lot about tailoring medication individually to people, because each person responds differently. And the difference comes about in two ways, because you have two aspects here. Drugs interact with the human body, and the human body interacts with the drug. So what the body does to the drug and what the drug does to the body is the two aspects. So we look at both of them and we try to determine what we call the genetic polymorphic differences in these. And of course my focus has been in the human brain. How does the human brain differ from other organs in the body in terms of the way it handles the drugs?
How does it differ?
It does. I mean, more recently we have shown that the brain has a propensity to generate, given a single gene, it has a propensity to generate several different proteins from it by a mechanism that we call alternate splicing. So I think this is one way of the brain, taking the limiting factor of those 30,000 genes and still being able to have the diversity it needs. So we have been able to show that in the human brain we have several of these gene products that are not there in other organs, and those handle the drugs very differently and give us those myriad effects that we see.
As a researcher in the cutting edge, as it were, of this area, what sort of reassurances, and we don't have time and we would love to have talked about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and schizophrenia and many of the other sort of everyday associations with brain malfunction and problems of the brain. What reassurances, what hope does research offer that in our lifetimes, and of course our lifetimes may vary, what hope can we offer to people?
See, the last decade or so has seen a big dramatic improvement in the discovery of rational therapies. See, whether we take for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or schizophrenia, several new drugs have come out, some serendipitously, some based on good research findings. The cures are still far away. We have no cures for any of the neurodegenerative disorders or no cures for any of the mental illnesses. We have therapies. I feel the next 2 decades we are going to see cures. I honestly hope that the National Brain Research Center would contribute towards something like that.
And about the time you're ready to sort of, well, I wouldn't say throw the towel in, but let's say put down the baton of, at the National Brain Research Center, what will you hope to have achieved there?
See, NBRC was a big challenge because neuroscience, clinical neuroscience in the country has been really doing well. We have very talented neurosurgeons and neurologists. But on the research front, we have lagged behind. And the National Brain Research Center was the first effort by the Government of India to put together an institute that will encompass the molecules to mind concept.
What is your personal agenda, your personal dream?
My personal dream for NBRC?
And for yourself, in working in this area?
Well, for the institute, I would dream, my dream is it will be the foremost and one of its kind in the world.
And for you personally,
for
your
me
work?
Personally, you know what, I have become so integrated with NBRC, I hardly have a dream of my own now. But if NBRC does well, I will take it that I have done well.
Thank you very much. This has been a great pleasure. Thank you.